the bat, I'm gonna go through the questions one by one.
Okay.
So yeah, the first one I want to start with was, what would you say have been some of the major mistakes on the part of the West regarding the post-1991 Eastern
Yeah.
European strategy? So
Yeah.
since the Cold War.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I think mistake is a mild term. It was more, I would characterize the response of the West to the dissolution of the Soviet Union a missed opportunity. It was a missed opportunity to start really a new chapter in international relations, because to understand that, you have to see how the Americans saw the collapse of the Soviet Union and what it really was. The Americans saw the collapse of the Soviet Union as their victory. See, they defined it as their victory. We won in the Cold War. The war is to be won. Americans love to win, so they won it. Now, this is, of course, wrong, totally wrong, because the argument that the Soviet Union ran out of money because of the arms race is ridiculous. It has nothing to do with reality. The Soviet Union collapsed of its own collapsed ideology, collapsed Communist Party, a reawakened society. And it was really the victory of Gorbachev's idea of new human values for everybody. And this the West, for some reason, didn't take seriously, even though that was very serious. And it was not only Gorbachev. One thing that I always mention in this regard is that in 1991, there were demonstrations in Moscow, so hundreds of thousands of people, I think 200,000, shouting for your freedom and ours. This was at the time when Gorbachev considered sending troops to Lithuania. In other words, the Russian society was in favor of a new brotherhood relationship with even those people who were part of the Soviet Union. They said, yeah, you can go, you can have your independence. We are with you. We would love you to have what you want. And how did the Lithuanians pay back? 20 years later, they're the most ardent, the most Russia-hating country next to Poland. So I can understand them. I mean, I can understand it because there were deportations, because there was, all kinds of things that Stalinists did to them. But that's the problem with your question, or I answered your questions. They reacted as if they were in 1945. Well, this was like 50 years later. The way correctly to respond to the collapse of the Soviet Union is to start a new chapter, which means Warsaw Pact is out, NATO is out, there's a new collective security agreement, and try to live without this kind of a rivalry and my empire, your empire. So historically, the West really lost an opportunity that could cost very dearly. It could wind down into a big war. It's a lost opportunity. It's very regrettable.
So you'd say it was a bit of a naive and hopeful moment in Russian history in the late 80s that kind of led to the situation today now.
But it's not like it was totally hopeless, because
I meant hopeful in the sense there's a lot of hope for the future, because
there was, and I think that there were some chances for it. For example, when you would be totally amazing now to look at the pictures of Putin with Bush, and they were hugging each other and saying, my friend. And Putin and Schröder, Chancellor of Germany, they were actual friends. Putin and Berlusconi and Chirac. I mean, there were good relations. There were really normal, good relations with most of the Western countries. And for some reason, by 2007, when Putin gave a speech at Munich, and he said Americans don't want partners, they want subordinates, and they're building a single world, it all kind of fizzled out. And that is a shame. And one more point about this. When I read about the history of the Baltics in the 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, they wanted to join into NATO. They were pushing Bush. Bush wasn't sure. But his advisors basically said, look, these people really like us, and Russia may or may not like us. why don't we have those people in our camp, and then we'll see what happens later with Russia.
Yeah.
And I also remember at that time that Professor Pipes, who is a very prestigious professor of Russian history, and he was advisor to Reagan, and he was my colleague in Harvard. And so he was against admitting the Baltics, because he was saying at that time, this would really upset the Russians long term.
Yeah.
We don't need it for our security. They don't need it for their security. A much better solution would have been expanding neutral Europe, such as Finland and Sweden was. If the Baltics were neutral countries having whatever political system, whatever economic system, but no military alliances right next to Russian borders, I think everybody would have been happy, and they would have lived with it, and America would have not insisted on NATO. This was another wrong term. The Baltics should not have been admitted into NATO.
Right. No, yeah, that makes sense. So by picking one side, you obviously antagonize the other.
Yeah.
But yeah, so to transition to the next question, actually. So in terms of like NATO members, right?
Yeah.
So we often hear the claim that no country has ever been, forced into NATO as opposed to the Warsaw Pact, and all members have joined by their own free will, often due to national security from Russia. So for, like you said, Latvia, Lithuania, all those Baltic states. So, and another recent example is Finland and Sweden joining this year because of the situation in Ukraine. So you can make an argument that NATO expansion is caused by a history of aggressive foreign policy from Russia. So how do you really respond to that?
Yeah, I will respond like this. First of all, it's wrong to say that there were that all countries joined voluntarily. That's not the case. Especially in regard to Germany. When NATO was founded, I believe it was Churchill who put it like this: the purpose of NATO is to keep Russia out, Germany down, and the US in. Now, it's a very, very concise and precise definition of what was NATO for. In other words, the British policy, which Americans have inherited, has always been that there should not be any country dominating the continent. And so Churchill was so upset, not really about communism, but about the fact that Russia wound up dominating half the continent in his famous speech, from Stettin in the north to Trieste in the south, blah, blah, blah. Iron Curtain has fallen upon Europe. That's what he was afraid about. And NATO was a very convenient tool to expand Anglo-American influence. It was not so much about defense. It was just to keep Russia out. Now, if we go one by one, the countries that were supposedly voluntarily joined NATO, Portugal never had any military issues with Russia. Spain, no military issues with Russia. Italy, Greece, all of these countries joined NATO. Yeah.
Sorry, you mentioned Italy, and yes, they never went to war with Russia, although there were some Italians in the Eastern Front. But what about like the tampering and the connection between the Soviet Union and the communist parties in Italy and Spain?
Yeah, Communist Party of Italy, this is another American myth. It was Italian made. It was not made by the Russians. The Communist Party of Italy and the Italian communists were the ones who were fighting the fascists and Mussolini, and they overthrew Mussolini completely on their own in 1943. So it was an Italian product. It was the paradox, of course, is this is
to clarify my question. I mean, like the potential from the perspective of like the Americans and the British, there's potential like tampering of like domestic politics by
potentially, yes, but who was doing the tampering? It was the Americans.
Yeah,
they were the ones who were interfering in elections in post-war years in Italy, in France, and in Germany. So they were the ones who actually were forcing most of these countries to join NATO, not because they needed it for their security, but because It implied martial aid, it implied economic assistance, it implied political influence, and they didn't care. Why not? Okay, so if Americans want to give us money, and for that we need to be in a joint military alliance, and there's no enemy who to fear, so they joined in. Now there are other countries that just sold themselves, such as Macedonia. I'm sorry, the Montenegro.
Yeah.
I mean, they were the ones who joined. We actually, Suleiman, I think, was in the group when we traveled to Montenegro. The Montenegro leadership wants to join NATO just for one and only reason: money. They were bought, essentially. They were bribed with all the economic assistance and the EU money coming in and investment. And for that, join NATO. And so they did. They were part of Serbia, and therefore they were Russian allies. And then they split from Serbia, even though they are Serbs.
Yeah.
It's a province of Serbia, and now they're a NATO country. So, but I admit to you, there are countries that really fear Russia out of historical reasons. These are the Baltic countries.
Poland,
this is, of course, Poland, Romania, and they have good reason to fear Russia. However, that's like 50 years ago, 70 years ago, 100 years ago. This does not mean that you have to project this fear into contemporary situation, because in contemporary situation, especially after 1991, Russia was not a military threat to any of these countries.
But what about if you're directing foreign policy from a country like Poland, obviously the situation within the past 5 years, say in the 90s, is very different and very unique historically. But if you look through the history of your country, right, Poland, obviously you're going to worry about any aggression from Germany and any aggression from Russia. And
yes, that's
at
true.
the time, there's no worry about Germany because the Americans, like you said, dominate Germany through NATO. But
that's true.
Obviously, wouldn't it be in your interest to potentially prevent any future threats coming from Russia, especially given that historic precedent, right?
That's true, but it's very important to put it in the context, which is that about a third of today's Poland is the territory it received from Stalin.
Yeah.
So if Stalin wanted to destroy Poland, he could have. He could have done whatever he wanted to with it, because there was no force that could have stopped him. He could have incorporated Poland into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics because it used to be part of the Russian Empire. He didn't. He kept the independence. He gave them huge chunks of German territory. The only thing that he took, and this is something that the Poles say, he took our eastern Poland. No, he didn't, because Vilnius is a capital of Lithuania. It used to be part of Poland. Lviv is a part of Ukraine, and it was a part of Poland. Yeah. And half of Belarusia is Russian Orthodox Belarusians, and the Poles considered Eastern Poland. Well, it was never Eastern Poland. It became Poland in 1920 when independent Poland, independent after the Russian Revolution, went to war against communist Russia, and Lenin was so lenient with territories that he said, okay, you can have it. So they grabbed half of Lithuania, half of Belarusia, and a big chunk of Ukraine and Lithuania, and this is how it became Poland.
So would you say Stalin, in regards of his policies towards Poland after the Second World War, did he give them land out of the goodness of his heart, or did he give it simply to create a buffer between him and the West, right?
No, he gave them because he was very upset with the Germans. He wanted to weaken Germany. This was the priority, to make Germany not a military threat. And so for that reason, he thought that Poland would be grateful and it would be an ally of the Soviet Union. And for that reason, he obviously kept the Orthodox Belarusian and Ukrainian population, but he did give them, look, if you look at Kaliningrad Oblast, Kaliningrad, if you look attentively, it's only half of East Prussia. Why couldn't Stalin keep all of East Prussia as Kaliningrad region? He could have, but he gave it half of it, just exactly half was given to Poland. In addition to Silesia, Breslau, Wroclaw, and other territories. So he wanted to weaken Germany and to strengthen Poland, make it a good ally. Now, for some reason, contemporary Polish leadership don't talk about it. That a third of your country, you should put monuments to Stalin everywhere because he gave it to them.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So for the sake of time, on to the next question. So some claim that NATO, being a defensive alliance, will never strike first, right?
Yes.
And also because of Russia's possession of a nuclear arsenal, it would be suicide for anybody to directly invade Russia, right? So why is it then that Russia is worried about NATO enlargement if a direct war between the two is theoretically impossible? And if there was ever a war between Russia and NATO, it would quickly lead to a nuclear holocaust that would render any conventional military advantage irrelevant.
Yeah, this is all hypothetical questions. One could reverse that question and say, if everything you say is true, then why did the United States want to put nuclear missiles in Poland and in Romania? That's after 1991. This is like in the last 20 years, in addition to the ones they have in Britain, in Germany, in Turkey, and in Italy. Why? If you know, one could say there's no point because nuclear war would be a disaster. Putin answered that question once. They asked him, why are you so worried about these missiles that are put in Poland and in Romania? And he said, well, because with each time they put missiles closer to our borders, the time that it takes for a missile to fly is shorter. And this is one of the reasons with the war in Ukraine. It started when Zelensky asked the West to put missiles in Kharkov. And that means like 300 kilometers from Moscow.
It's like
that makes a difference.
Yeah. So it's mostly just giving that time to react if there's ever a first strike.
Yes, exactly. If you're surrounded by bases as Russia is from all sides with the US, yes, there's a fear of a first strike that would incapacitate your armed forces in one strike, and whatever is remnants that are left over are not enough to survive. This is obviously a fear. Yeah.
But can't you make the counter argument then that if we assume that the political elites in somewhere like Poland or Ukraine are worried about potential aggression coming from Russia, it would make sense for them to want to have nuclear weapons placed in their territory in order to prevent, right? Because if there's nuclear missiles in Kharkiv, in Kiev, then Russia is going to think twice before they're going to, you know, try to send troops in, because that's obviously a much riskier military operation.
Yeah, I know, but it doesn't add to Russia's security. And so they would have, if this were to happen, they would find ways or try to find ways to disable those weapons without using nuclear weapons. By the way, this just brings the issue. It's this absolutely ridiculous talk that is going on in Western media about Russia hitting Ukraine with nuclear missiles. It's such an idiocy. It's such an impossibility that I don't even understand how anybody can seriously talk about it. If Russia considers Ukraine part of its culture and nature and territory, and it wants to take Novorossiya, why in the world would they destroy it for generations with a nuclear strike? It's absurdity to the absurdity. The last thing Russians want is to hit Ukraine. Even if there was a real big war, I think the place they would hit would be Ramstein, an American base in Germany, not in Ukraine.
So you don't think there's any realistic scenario right now where they can use like a low-grade tactical
absolutely
weapon,
not.
just like on the battlefield?
This is all inventions of American propaganda. This is total nonsense. There's no way whatsoever that Russia could use nuclear weapons of any intensity in Ukraine. Nothing. As I said, if there's a direct strike on Russia, they will blow up American fleet. They may even blow up Ramstein with some although American bases would go first. And this is why it's really foolish on the part of Finland and Poland and Sweden to join NATO, because they're not a target now as being neutral. But if they put American bases in their territory, they will be a target. It's just the way it is. They will be a target.
Wait, so I actually have a question, because I don't remember the exact source, but I remember reading somewhere that in Russian military doctrine, like any full-blown conflict with NATO would have also involved a conflict with Finland, just because of the border and obviously
no, not really.
That was all.
If there's missiles flying and there's nothing in Finland, then there's nothing in Finland. Why should Finland be hit?
So now you're saying they're on the target, basically, as opposed to before.
At this moment, I don't know, but it just declaring that they're in NATO doesn't mean anything, except that Finnish army is going to take orders from Washington. Yeah. But if there are no threat, actual physical threat coming from Finland, you have to prioritize your targets. If I was in the Russian General Staff, the priority is to hit American bases where the missiles are, and not Finland that doesn't have any. Yeah. So, if it comes to a big conflict, the first targets would be US missiles in Poland, Romania, England, and elsewhere.
Yeah. What about, I know this is a bit different than the questions I wrote, but since you brought up like that nuclear weapons is ridiculous to use in Ukraine, and I can see where you're coming from. What about, are you concerned about like the Zaporizhzhia power plants or anything like that?
Yes, that I'm very concerned about. And I also am totally surprised that Western media and Western leaders are not worried about this, because the Ukrainians are shooting at it. Real stuff. It could happen. I mean, one of their missiles can go straight and actually hit it. And then what? I mean, like millions of people will die and hundreds of thousands. I don't know what exactly would happen. So Macron says, you Russians get out, and then there would be no danger. That's not serious. It's not serious. They're not going to get out, especially now that they proclaimed it part of their territory. But it's totally irresponsible to allow the Ukrainians to shoot at the nuclear station. It should be considered a zone of no military action. The Ukrainians say we do it because the Russian military are there. Or if they're just there, but they're not shooting, don't shoot either. And come to some kind of understanding that there's a war, but there's no war where the nuclear facilities are. One could make that kind of arrangement, but somehow they're not doing it. But in the last few days, I'm less worried, because Rosatom took it under control. They're winding it down. They're shutting down the reactors, so that even if they're hit, there wouldn't be any danger of a working reactor. It's going to take some time for it to cool off, but the Russians actually don't need it as a source of electricity. They can restart it when peace comes. But for the moment, they're really kind of trying to wind it down and close it.
So okay. That sounds a bit reassuring, I guess. So let's move on to, I guess, the next question. So given the present situation, obviously, a security regimen based on military confrontation and alliance blocks has clearly been shown to have its limits. And alternative models, such as you mentioned, collective security, common security, call it whatever you want, that kind of idea, which basically rests on the idea that, a country can only feel safe when their counterparts feel safe as well. So those models have been suggested. And so let's kind of explore that. What do you think of, obviously, collective security? Do you think it's realistic? And how do you think it could be incorporated into a future settlement? If at all?
Yeah, no, I do think theoretically this is possible, to create a system of collective security where there are limits on what a country can do militarily. The system where NATO has all the bases in the world and Russia feels threatened is dangerous. It could really trigger a conflict. Now, the difficulty, of course, is that countries have different interests and different perceptions. And Ukraine wants independence, and Ukraine says Donbass is Ukraine. Well, the Donbass people say, no, we don't want to be a part of Ukraine. So what do you do in a situation like this? And there are many others like Barcelona, I mean, Catalonia, they don't want to be part of Spain. Spain says, no, you are Spain. And as long as nobody supports Barcelona, they are, they're stuck. They have nothing to do except to accept the will of Madrid. Now, suppose if Putin said, no, we are going to supply missiles to Barcelona, so just like the West does. Suppose that Russian army would move in with their and say, we will provide you anything at all you need, just like Americans do in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Now, everybody will say, oh, this is destabilizing. Oh, Putin is a Hitler, blah, blah, blah. Now, but this is what the West is doing. The West is using Ukraine. This is why it's so upsetting. I'm not upset at the Ukrainians. They're brothers. Ukrainians are brothers. This is the same people, the same. I feel pain when Ukrainian soldiers are dying just as much as when the Russian soldiers are dying, especially when I see the civilians being hit. But who is providing all these newest weapons to Ukraine? The US does, because the US wants to use every opportunity to hurt and hit Russia. And this is why it's very counterproductive. I just hope that there are other forces than Biden and the Anglo-imperialists and the globalists in America. I just hope that reason would prevail and that somebody would be there who would say, okay, let's make a deal. Look, what Putin offered them was a really good deal. Maybe they would understand it. The deal is Ukraine is not a member of NATO, period. There are no military bases in Ukraine of any kind. And then you have an internationally supervised referendum, internationally, not Russian supervised. Let UN, let anybody come and ask the people of Donbass, where do you want to be? And people in Crimea, where do you want to be?
But how would they be able to do that in a war? Right? It's already difficult to run an election in peace
settlement. In a war, you can't do that. But if there is a solution, if there is a peace process, if there's some way to find a way out of it, but Putin did offer Minsk Accords. Look, Ukraine could have had Donbass as officially a part of its territory. All they had to agree was autonomy. And they refused it. I remember for years, Putin was saying there's no alternative to Minsk. There's no alternative. And I was thinking, why not? There are always alternatives to things. So then he says, fine, you can have it. You have Ukraine in EU, whatever, but no NATO. The West said, no, everybody has a right to be in NATO. Russia said, no, we're not going to allow Ukraine in NATO. We're not going to allow American missiles in Kharkov, period. So now we're in a situation where somebody will win and somebody will lose. And the side that wins, the side that loses may want to up the stakes and go for higher and better weapons. And this is how it can escalate easily to a nuclear war. But not Russian nuclear war in Ukraine. No, nuclear war meaning hitting US, hitting American fleet, hitting Ramstein and other American bases in Europe.
Yeah. So that's basically Russia has the escalatory advantage in this scenario, right? Because for them, a loss in Ukraine would mean much more than a loss for the US, right?
Yeah,
that's what
a loss of Ukraine at this point would mean that Putin would have to go. I mean, for him, it's a matter of life and death.
Yeah.
If he loses this war, there will be a more radical party. And you could already see some individuals who are joking to take this position, a more radical, a more nationalist party who would go all the way, who would make a mobilization, who would put 2 million if they need to and conquer all of Ukraine. And that's possible. They are already discussing which zones of Ukraine will be Russia and which ones would be kind of like an obedient satellite or something like this, but certainly not the current regime. Yeah, I hope they'll find a peaceful solution with autonomy and neutral status. That's the only thing that makes sense right now.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree with you on that.
Okay.
Right. So the second section of my question, answered it a bit earlier, but so in terms of the settlement, so do you think a settlement that could satisfy everybody's security needs, is it
Yeah.
even possible at this point in the conflict? And what do you see realistically happening
Okay.
as a conclusion, aside from maybe nuclear Armageddon?
Yeah. Yeah. I will start by saying that Putin provided a very interesting, detailed answer to a part of your question. In Astana, a few days ago, there was a series of meetings with world leaders, and then there was an interview, press conference, and one of the Russian journalists asked him about the peace process. And he said something very interesting. He said that at the beginning of the war, with Turkish participation, there were peace talks. And what I didn't know, and that what he said in this answer or question, he said that the agreement was reached and that the Ukrainians actually accepted it and signed it. And then they walked away.
Yeah.
Because of American pressure. So he basically said that we Russians pulled our troops out of Kiev as a gesture of goodwill, and then they deceived us. In other words, that's the way he presented it. I don't know if it's true or not. Maybe it looked like they withdrew it because they transferred it to Donbass. But in any case, the idea, what I think he's right about, is that the United States, by providing weapons of any kind without any limit, more than to any other country or to any NATO country ever, is prolonging the conflict.
Yeah.
That raised the stakes, and Putin did something that was not in the cards. Nobody thought that he would do it, which is include 5 new regions or provinces into the Russian Federation. He did that because Russia was losing, because the breakthrough at Kharkov made it very dangerous for him. He had to show something. And so he basically said, okay, well, now it's going to be Russian territory and we're going to fight for Russia, not for Donbass as a friendly country. So the point is that when the Americans raised the stakes, Putin answered. It's a kind of a chess game going on, or ping pong, whatever. And now each time they escalate higher, it's more and more difficult, because one thing was to accept Donbass. Now Zelensky would have to accept 5 provinces. And my understanding, it, I might be wrong, is what Putin is trying to signal to the West and to Zelensky is that this is the deal that he can accept at this point. He loses Crimea, he loses Donbass, and he loses Kherson and Zaporozhye. But if he doesn't accept this, the next time around, he would have to accept even more losses, because a lot of Russians really consider Odessa a Russian city. Many never, if you say to the Russian, Odessa is Ukrainian city, they would laugh at you.
Oh,
it's not a Russian city. It's Ukrainian city. So a lot of people want to push on to Nikolaev and Odessa and then make a peace offer. Some people want to go even further. Some people, when I listen to the debates on Russian political observers, they say we should not allow any part of Ukraine to be NATO. Even if it remains independent, the purpose would be to wipe out this government and this regime and have a kind of a satellite regime in Ukraine that would be no threat to Russia, even if it's not going to be part of the Russian Federation.
Do you see the Ukrainians ever agreeing to this at this point, in terms of all the political forces in the country deciding to become a political
I don't know. The Germans didn't want to lose the war.
Yeah.
It's not that somebody's going to ask them. If they lose, if the Russian army wins, then they would have to accept the settlement that as a losing side they would. Moreover, you see, what shouldn't be forgotten is that I'm maybe I'm wrong, but I think that if Odessa was given a free choice under international supervision, even today, I think the majority of people there would would vote to be Russian, because they are Russian, because there are no Ukrainians there. The Ukrainian language is not spoken in Odessa. So from that point of view, places like Vinnytsia and Rovno and Lviv, they are Ukrainian, no question about it. And they would want to keep as much independence as possible, and probably would be anti-Russian. And I don't blame them, because that's their history and they have good enough reasons to dislike the Russians. But, Professor Huntington wrote 20 years ago in The Clash of Civilization that Ukraine is an artificial creation. And he wrote it, not me. He wrote back then that this country cannot survive with this kind of polarity, one being Russian and Orthodox, the other gravitating towards Vienna and Western Europe. So they've been separate for centuries, and then Stalin put them together. Well, it seems like it doesn't work. I mean, Western Ukrainians and Eastern Ukrainians and Russians, there's three types. Central Ukraine is they speak a dialect which is very different than the one that is spoken in Lviv. And of course, in Kharkov, they speak Russian. I've been there many, many times, and I know these areas because part of my job in the 90s was to go there on an American program. And I used to come to Kharkiv just about every 3 months. So I know the area very well.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with you on that. Like as someone myself, actually, like I was born in Toronto, but my parents are both from Kiev, and my family is everywhere from Donetsk to Lviv. It's Lvov. Yeah, it's a very complicated country in terms of the political mess, but yeah, so I kind of want to talk about this actually as kind of like the last question. So you did mention, like, at the end of the day, especially a lot of people from your generation, they don't really see it as a Russian-Ukrainian conflict, as opposed to like almost like a civil war between Soviet states, right? Especially like my parents' generation see it that way as well. Like, it just doesn't make sense to a lot of people. And obviously, like, it's a tragedy that the two brotherly people are kind of killing each other for the past year. So how do you see all this impacting Russian-Ukrainian relations, 20, 30 years from now, 50 years from now? Do you have any hope that there could ever be reconciliation, or do you think this war has permanently created this wedge between Ukraine and Russian people that might never fully heal? If there wasn't a wedge before, right? Some people say there was.
It's a very difficult question, because it's always hard to project into the future. But it all depends what part of Ukraine you're talking about. And I think in each one of them, there will be different reactions and different hopes and expectations. I watch a lot of Ukrainian news, but not the kind that are pro-Zelensky. There are several channels that I watch that are Ukrainians who are pro-Russian, and they hope for Russian victory. And their reasoning basically is that Zelensky sold out Ukraine to the West. And they give you all kinds of statistics about, all the good stuff in Ukraine, all the natural resources, all the good factories, everything is sold to Western oligarchs who are robbing the country. And so their reasoning why they want the Russians is because they want to put an end to that rule of oligarchy that is selling their country off. So to put it in simple terms, I would say that the people of Donbass and the Russian-speaking east of the Dnieper definitely will join Russia and will be totally happy that the war ends, and they would rediscover that Kharkov is a Russian city and Odessa is a Russian city. As far as Western Ukraine, the more west you go, the more resentment of the Russians there will be for a very long time, especially in places like Lviv and their entire history. I'm just now writing, a project, and I took some time, the documents of the partisan war in Lviv region from 1945 to 1953. It's astonishing. There were 80,000 casualties. Russian soldiers died, and there were 200,000 casualties on the Ukrainian side. It was a real war. It was like a real big war at that time. The Ukrainians call it the war of subjugation, and it was. I mean, it was Stalinist regime, imposing its will on Ukraine. However, there are other examples, such as, the GDR, within 10 years, they became friends with Russia. And the friendly feelings to Russia in eastern part of Germany continue to the present day. So it seems to me that, and there's so many relatives and there's so many families that my grandmother was born in Ukraine. In fact, I have a right to Ukrainian citizenship because my mother was born in Ukraine before they moved to St. Petersburg, Leningrad. So the families are all mixed up, and they perceive each other as one, at least historically. So the West was going to resent Russian rule. The center would find some kind of, it depends a lot on how good the Russians are. If they start rebuilding them, presuming they win, if they start raising their standard of living as they do in Donbass, then the reconciliation could come fairly quickly. If, on the other hand, it doesn't end in any clear-cut way, and the war may continue to linger on for another 8 and 10 and 15 years, the longer it lasts, the bigger the rift, and the more difficult it would be to overcome that rift among the people.
So basically, depending on which part of Ukraine and how successful Russian reconstruction would be, you would say, assuming, reconstruction goes well and all these family ties and cultural ties between the people, you do have hope that maybe eventually there could be some sort of...
I think within 10 years, we could be back to normal. It's just that, the sooner they sign peace and the sooner they agree that it's a neutral country and they can join EU in the West if they want to, that's fine. And central Ukraine may choose to be whatever it wants to be, like Hungary or like Belarusia or whatever. And Eastern Ukraine joins Russia, then the process of reconciliation and rebuilding may commence. It also depends a lot on the European Union. Today, the leadership of European Union is very, very anti-Russian. But there are forces in Europe that are not, such as new Italian government. And there are forces like that in France that want much better relations with Russia than Macron does. And there are forces like that in Germany, let alone Hungary and Greece and Austria. So if leadership in Europe takes a more constructive role in trying to be a bridge between East and West, because US and Russia, there's a formula can be found that would be satisfactory to most people, including Ukrainians.
And would you, personally, do you think it's realistic that could happen in the next 10 years? I know it's a bit tough to predict the future, especially as a historian, because there's so many factors that go into it. But could you see the EU becoming more softer towards Russia, especially given the current energy crisis and all that stuff?
Well, I do think so, yes, because I see what's happening in France. A lot of people don't like Macron and his policies. And there's a kind of a tendency shaping up that everybody who doesn't like the current government or the US is waving Russian flags. And that you could see in Africa and in Haiti and in many other places. So, Putin has been painted such a devil that he isn't really. He is actually much more open to a deal and a compromise than many of his generals who are now vying for power. And the West, if they're smart politicians, they would make a deal with Putin because he's ready for a deal. Except
He's
that
better than the alternative, right?
Yes, the conditions are now worse for Ukraine than they were. Now they're going to lose 5 provinces, but that still is better than lose your statehood or lose completely, you know, have a satellite regime imposed on you, like in Chechnya. I mean, realistically, Putin is open for a deal, and a deal means you get something, the other side gets something. The only condition that is not up to negotiation is Ukraine must not be a member of NATO. If the West can live with that, and I think a lot of Europeans can live with that, and the war ends, and then the borders are discussed, and again, Putin is flexible. My personal feeling is that he would even agree to a status quo. Like it is where it is now, just freeze it. Even though part of Zaporozhye province would not be Russian and part of other, even I think Donetsk would have to, for political reasons, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, they would have to get it. But as for the new territories, I think he would agree in a grand deal to keep things as they are today. So that means there's room for maneuver if there was a willingness to do that. Now, a lot depends on the elections in the United States. Are the Democrats going to keep the House or not? Is Trump going to win or not? And to what extent Macron is not going to be elected for another term? He can't. So there'll be, in a few years, there'll be a new president in France. Will it be Le Pen or will it be some other rightist coalition? And how they're going to look at things. So there are many, many questions that are open, but the tendency is not good for the Western camp. I think that the worse the economic situation is in Europe, the more likely the opposition parties to come to power. They're not stupid to say, oh, it's the Russians' fault. No, it's not just the Russians' fault. It's their own policy's fault as well. So it seems like, you know, there's glimmer of a hope at the end of the tunnel sometime. And you know, you may not like what I say, but I think Putin is the best bet to strike a deal. Because, as I said, if he loses, it'd be more radical generals who would come to power. The liberals have no chance whatsoever, and the communists either. So, and even if the communists take over in Russia, they are the ones who've been shouting louder than others, all of Ukraine is part of the Soviet Union. So they're not going to be any easier to deal with. The liberals lost it. They're out. They made it completely. They have 3% of the population. They can gather meetings for Navalny, but they have no popular support. And therefore, you know, a realistic Western statesman should get together and say, okay, let's make a deal. And the deal is possible. And finally, I think this is what Putin is trying to do now. I think his latest message that I saw in Astana is to show to Zelensky, look, we're open for a compromise. And there's one other commentator who said that Putin mentioned that they left Kiev and then Zelensky stopped negotiations. And this commentator suggested that maybe what Putin wants is to enter Kiev one more time, and maybe then Zelensky would be willing to negotiate. So one interpretation that's going on in the Russian media is that Putin is preparing an offensive to knock out Zelensky's chances and then offer him a deal. So if one could imagine that in the next 3 months, Russian army enters Kiev and then says, okay, we're going to keep our 5 provinces plus Odessa. Take this deal if you want to. If not, we're going to occupy all of Ukraine. This is like a theory. I don't know validity of it, but it seems that what Putin wants to do is to force Zelensky to sign peace. That's whether this is going to happen or not, nobody knows. But he does not want all of Ukraine as part of the Russian Federation. It's too expensive, and it's just
impossible to hold.
Impossible. So the deal is where the border lies, and the most important for Russia, no NATO. We'll see. We'll see if they accept it, and Zelensky will accept something that Americans would accept. So a lot depends on the politics in the United States.
Yeah, no, yeah. Hopefully they figure something out soon.
Yes, right.
Yeah, war at the end of the day doesn't, in my opinion, I don't think it gets anybody anywhere in the grand scheme of things. But
yeah.
Anyways, yeah, thank you so much. It's been over an hour now.
Okay.
Yeah, though that's pretty much the end of my questions.
Thank you.
I want to thank you very much for taking time out of your day to do this.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
It was very informative. You brought up a lot of very interesting stuff that I definitely will be writing about in the future. So yeah, no, thank you so much, and I'll keep in touch with you in the next coming weeks. And also, I want to ask, are you comfortable with me using your name in the art, in like quotations or anything like that, or would you prefer?
Yeah, no, I'm perfectly fine. And as I said, I have YouTube channel, and I'm not hiding my views. And I'm fine with that. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to make sure everything is going to be okay on your end. So.
Okay. Thank you very much.
No worries. All right. You have a great evening.